So I would imagine that some of you, upon reading this article by Bostrom, who, by the way, is not an English guy, as I said, he's a Swedish person who happens to teach in England, Nick Bostrom. But I would imagine that some of you, upon reading this article, might object on either religious grounds or just generally humanist grounds to the very idea of intervening in human nature. He certainly has anticipated that objection. For instance, on page 4, he says, in contrast to many other ethical outlooks, which in practice often reflect a reactionary attitude to new technologies, and reactionary means to fear or oppose something simply because it's new, or simply because it's different, or simply because it'll change things without really thinking the thing through. That's really kind of, I guess, an accusation on Bostrom's part. But in contrast to many other ethical outlooks, which in practice often reflect a reactionary attitude to new technologies, the transhumanist view is guided by an evolving vision to take a more proactive approach to technology policy. This affirmation of human potential, he continues a little later, is offered as an alternative to customary injunctions against playing God, messing with nature, tampering with our human essence, or displaying punishable hubris. Now, I would say that this particular article is a manifesto, really, rather than a full defense of transhumanism. It's really explaining what transhumanism is and promoting it, rather than really defending it in any kind of substantive way. But what he's saying right now is that he denies the idea that somehow playing God or messing with nature, tampering with our human essence, that there's not anything essentially wrong with that. No, he's not. Again, he hasn't argued for it. But then again, and he would need to argue for it, for his position. Wouldn't you need to argue for the other position? That is, what is inherently wrong about intervening in human nature, our own nature, in a purely consensual way? I mean, one of the things that he says later on, this is page 11, that transhumanists typically place emphasis on individual freedom and individual choice. That is, one of the values, that seems to be one of the prime values of his version of transhumanism. One of the values here is that individuals should always have the choice of whether they want to make such interventions in their nature. That it couldn't be a collective and coercive thing, but rather it would have to be a matter of individual choice. That is, one would need to decide whether changing one's nature in a radical way was something that was a good idea. He continues on page 11, he says, but the mere fact that somebody may be disgusted or morally affronted by somebody else's using technology to modify herself would not normally be a legitimate ground for coercive interference. That is, because I think he's saying that if someone has religious or other grounds for objecting personally to these kind of interventions, these transhumanist sort of projects, that they should never be, he's not suggesting at all they should be coerced into doing something. It's just that they would have the right to deny other people the right to do it. So let's look at some, in particular, I mean, this is just a general idea, this idea of transhumanism, which, as I said in the last talk, really does connect up with a lot of the earlier things that we read. In certain ways, I suggested it connected with Kant's idea of enlightenment. In certain ways, it certainly is drawing upon Darwin. And in certain ways, it is similar to the kind of existentialist view that Sartre had, that humans make themselves, that we make ourselves with our own choices. Sartre didn't have the kind of technological and biological choices in mind that Bostrom does, but it's certainly not foreign to that attitude. There's certain things which are quite similar, but what are some of the things he's talking about here, and what might be Bostrom's reasons for thinking that these are good changes in human nature that make life better for us, and what might be some of the reasons that other people might object. I think that vaguely there's a lot of suggestion here about changing ourselves biologically to increase our intellect. Of course, and he does mention briefly the existence or the possibility of drugs that would increase our intellectual abilities. No such drug currently exists. However, there's a widely used family of drugs that increase our attention span, which are basically amphetamines, but things like Adderall and other drugs that are prescribed for attention deficit disorder, and widely used by people who don't have attention deficit disorder, but students use it a lot. What is wrong with that? I mean, what would be wrong with that? I don't know. The problem with all drugs, of course, is dependency and side effects, and there certainly are dependency issues with drugs like Adderall and side effects. They're not something that are simple to use. But I think that Bostrom is thinking in his sort of technologically progressive way that perhaps that definitely, I would say, eventually we will develop techniques, if not drug techniques, then genetic techniques to enlarge the intellectual capacity of human beings. And I suppose the question is, on a personal basis, is that something that you would want? And would you want to live in a society where people had the option of, really radically or greatly increasing their intellectual abilities? It, of course, raises all sorts of social problems, and one of the things that he wants to do in this essay is to say, well, transhumanists believe that none of these things should happen, that none of these interventions into human nature, changing human nature, and in his mind, bettering human nature, should become available to anyone until they're available to everyone. That is, it would be a terrible thing were these interventions only available to an elite, like the rich, or some self-appointed elite, like scientific elite, or intellectual elite, or ethnic elite. It would be a terrible, terrible thing. But still, it doesn't solve the problem of the social effects. That is, if we have society where certain people have enhancements, that would certainly have disruptions, and it would certainly put pressure. Something that he doesn't I don't think he addresses is that even if it weren't coercive in any kind of overt sense, that there would certainly be social pressures that would be put on individuals to make these enhancements just to keep up in a competitive society. I don't think that he deals with that in this essay, but I think that is it's a very important issue. Intellectual enhancement, I can't imagine how that would go about. But the thing that I think is of central interest to him, and something that may be more imaginable. A lot of this is very sort of science fiction-y, but he's sort of anticipating things that are likely, at least possible in the future, is the extension of the human lifespan, which is a very interesting subject. He says towards the end of the essay, page 13, he says, in the developed world, aging is currently the #1 killer. And it's interesting to think of aging as a killer on the same level of heart disease or cancer. Aging is also the biggest cause of illness, disability, and dementia. Even if all heart disease and cancer could be cured, life expectancy would increase by merely 6 to 7 years, which is a very interesting thing. That is, even if we could do away with the two most widespread lethal diseases, we would only be increasing our lifespan by 6 to 7 years, because old age would get us sooner rather than later. And he continues to say, anti-aging medicine is therefore a key transhumanist priority. And that's something to think about. That is, clearly, Bostrom is thinking of old age, or the aging process, as an evil, all along the lines of cancer or heart disease. That is something that we, in a sort of any rational approach, something that we, if we could, would get rid of. I'm not sure that that's really so simple. That is, I'm not sure that most rational people would agree that the aging process, getting older, heading towards an inevitable demise within 80 or so years of our births, that's not necessarily an obvious evil that we would want to get rid of. However, he offers some defense of that claim in the beginning of the essay when he suggests, well, what if Beethoven or Goethe, a great German poet, or other geniuses had lived hundreds of years? Where would they be now? Would they? He says, well, they might have just sort of stopped being, productive and become sort of cranky old people who only talked about what happened in their youth. But it could very well be that they would have developed far beyond even the heights that they developed in their actual lives. The notion to his mind that living for 70 or 80 years is just not enough time to really further even one major project in your life. And I guess he has the attitude of an intellectual philosopher with grand ambitions to discover truth. And I've taught a class on death for many years, and many students who say that that's just not the way to think of it, that people haven't, most human beings, after they've lived 60, 70, 80 years, are pretty much ready to hang it up, even if they're in perfect health, which is not a thing that Bostrom, I think, takes into account, although it's quite plausible. So I would say, in general, a very interesting essay and something to think about, that human nature is changing anyway, I think, according to the Darwinian point of view. I mean, it's bound to change in the long run if evolution continues, which it will, in ways even without the struggle for existence. Right? So human nature is changing anyway. And wasn't it Kant who said that we should be always striving for living in better societies and bettering ourselves? Maybe Bostrom is just saying, well, let us take, if we have the technological capability to do it, let us take evolution in hand. If we have a way of changing our nature for the better, why wouldn't we take it? Well, maybe there's reasons, religious and other reasons, not to do it, but it's certainly a thesis that's not to be easily dismissed.